Hey guys, today I will be talking about top 10 of my favorite Terraria weapons. This video contains a list of my favorite Terraria weapons I ever used so far. And if you're wondering why the zenith isn't in this list is because I never tested the zenith yet. That's basically because I'm waiting for the 1.4 port for the Solar mod to release. Anyways, let us begin. Coming up to number 10 we have the Possessed Hatchet. The Possessed Hatchet is a weapon that is dropped by the golem after defeating him. When used, the hatchet will fly out of your hand and will hit an enemy. It deals 80 damage and more each hit. It's also very useful for many bosses like Duke Fisher or Plantera. Take this weapon against a boss like the Lepus for example. Here you see how much damage that this weapon deals against this army of Lepusers. So yeah, this weapon is very useful against bosses like this. But despite that, I rarely use the weapon. I don't really know why. But I decided not to use it cause it's just nothing but a flying hatchet. But despite that, it's extremely useful due to its high damage. Next is number 9, which is the Paladin's Hammer. The Paladin's Hammer is a weapon that is dropped by the Paladin after defeating one. When swung it deals 90 damage and more each hit. This weapon does a lot of damage against your enemies and each boss like Duke Fishman. It's a very useful weapon and it's even useful against multiple of enemies together too. So yeah, this weapon is one I recommend using. Next is number 8, which is the Scourge of the Corruptor. The Scourge of the Corruptor is a weapon that is found in corruption chests in the dungeon. The Scourge of the Corruptor when used fires a projectile that when hits something fires more projectiles. This weapon does 70 damage on each hit. This weapon is also very useful against events such like Pirates Invasion, Goblin Army, or the Frost Legion. So yeah, this weapon is a very good weapon against events. Next is number 7, which is a Bubble Gun. The Bubble Gun is a weapon that is dropped by Duke Fishman. It does a lot of damage against enemies and bosses. It fires bubbles that deal 70 damage. Now who wouldn't thought bubbles would be very powerful? This weapon is very useful in events like the Pumpkin Moon and the Frost Moon. So yeah, if you want to get very far in those events, use the Bubble Gun. Next is number 6, which is the Last Prism. The Last Prism is eventually a RNG weapon and is dropped by the Moon Lord. It's pretty much the most overpowered weapon I ever used. I mean look, it's literally a rainbow beam that kills everything in its way. This weapon is very useful against pretty much anything. I mean it does like 100 damage and it's very tanky and overpowered. This weapon is also used to kill the Moon Lord very quickly and such like that. It also costs a lot of mana, so yeah, you have to keep that in mind. So yeah, I really like this weapon, but it's just not good enough for me despite its high damage. Next is number 5, which is the Blizzard Staff. The Blizzard Staff is a weapon which is dropped by the Ice Queen from the Frost Moon. This weapon is very useful because when used it summons a storm of non-piercing icicles from above that travel in the general direction of the cursor. The Blizzard Staff does 58 damage against enemies. It can also shred bosses very quickly. Take the Golem for example. The Blizzard Staff quickly kills the Golem very fast. This weapon would also be useful against the Moon Lord too, but probably not do the most damage. Despite that, it's a very useful weapon against bosses and even more events like the Pumpkin Moon or the Frost Moon. So yeah, I recommend using this awesome weapon which does extreme damage to your enemies. Next is number 4, which is the Flareon. The Flareon is another weapon that is dropped from Duke Fishman like the Bubble Gun. When used it fires itself while releasing homing bubble projectiles at enemies. It does 66 damage to each enemy. It's very useful against the Dungeon Guardian because of the bubble projectiles. So yeah, this weapon is very useful and I love it. This weapon is also a common weapon I would use all the time. At number 3 we have the Solar Eruption. The Solar Eruption is a weapon that can be crafted with solar fragments that are dropped from the solar pillar. This weapon is very useful against the Moon Lord and is also useful against the Pumpkin Moon and Frost Moon too. This bad boy weapon deals 105 damage, so it's basically the strongest weapon I ever used so far. That is why the solar pillar is my favorite pillar out of the other pillars so far. So yeah, always choose the Solar Eruption cause it's the best one. At number 2 is the most common weapon I use all the time, the Vampire Knife. The Vampire Knife is a weapon that is found in Crimson chests. It's the most common weapon I use all of the time, and also one of my favorite The reason why is that when used, it steals health of your enemies and heals you. It's also always useful on huge boss fights due to its life-stealing effect. Unfortunately it's ineffective against Moon Lord cause of the damn moon bite effect. The vampire knives also only do 29 damage against each enemies, but despite that it's extremely useful. So yeah, the vampire knives is a weapon you should always use. And finally, at number 1, we have my favorite weapon of all time, the Terrorblade. The Terrorblade is one of my favorite weapons in Terraria. It's crafted with the true Excalibur and true Knight's Edge. It also does 115 damage, making this weapon the weapon with the most damage I ever used. I always use this weapon for the final blows on my enemies just to make it awesome. Also when using this weapon, it fires a green sword shaped projectile. This weapon is my favorite weapon in the game and the strongest one yet. So yeah, that's my favorite Terraria weapon. And that is my top 10 favorite Terraria weapons. I really can't wait to test out the Zenith soon, so yeah, see you all later.